The Lennox twins, Connor and Sam, were well known in the quiet town of Redwood. Growing up, the two were inseparable, often referred to as mirror images of each other. But beneath the surface, something darker simmered, an undercurrent of tension that no one else could see and shattered their lives to pieces. Physically, they were identical, both tall with brown hair and striking eyes, but in temperament, they were opposites. Connor was outgoing and confident, always the center of attention, while Sam was quieter, more introspective. Yet despite their differences, they had always been each other's anchor. However, as the years passed, the closeness that had once defined their relationship began to shift. Connor's charm and easy social life contrasted sharply with Sam's growing sense of isolation, and the bond that had once been their greatest strength started to feel more like a burden. Resentment, jealousy, and unspoken emotions began to fester, creating a rift between them that neither could fully comprehend. What appeared perfect on the outside hid the brewing storm that would soon consume them both. Their childhood had been marked by long stretches of silence in their home, the kind that only deepened with their parents' constant absences. Their mother, a nurse, worked long shifts, while their father, a traveling salesman, was rarely home. The twins learned early on to rely on one another. As children, this meant shared secrets, whispered conversations under the covers, and a silent understanding that no matter what happened in their household, they had each other. But as they grew older, something unspoken began to fester between them. It was subtle at first, so subtle that neither of them noticed the change until it had already taken root. It might have been the way Connor's gaze lingered a moment too long when Sam wasn't paying attention, or the way Sam would catch himself feeling relieved when Connor canceled a date with a girl just to spend the evening at home. They didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it. Perhaps because they were both too afraid of what it meant, too afraid to confront the truth. At first, it was easy to ignore. Their bond had always been strong, so what was a little more time spent together? They had shared everything growing up, secrets, dreams, even the same friends. But as the years passed, the time they spent alone became different, weighted with an energy that neither could explain. Connor, once confident and outgoing with girls, began to lose interest in his dates, coming home earlier than expected, his mood more introspective. He would sit on the couch with Sam, close but not too close, their knees brushing ever so slightly. But it was enough to send a strange thrill through Sam's body. Sam felt it too, the subtle shift in how they interacted. He found himself paying more attention to Connor, noticing the smallest things. The way Connor's lips curved when he smiled, the warmth of his laughter, the scent of his cologne when he passed by. And when they were alone, the silence between them stretched longer, thicker, filled with something unspoken. Sam would catch himself holding his breath during those quiet moments, his heart racing for reasons he didn't fully understand. Neither of them knew what to do with these feelings, so they kept them buried, pretending everything was as it always had been. But that tension lingered, growing heavier each day. The shift came slowly, over years, creeping into their lives like a shadow that neither could escape. It was after high school, during the long summer before college, that the tension between them began to bubble to the surface. Their days were filled with idleness, the kind of listless freedom that gave too much time for thinking. With their friends busy or working summer jobs, it was often just the two of them at home, a fact that began to feel less like comfort and more like something else entirely. One humid afternoon, they sat in their shared bedroom, the air thick with unspoken words. Connor was lying on his bed, flipping through a magazine, while Sam sat at his desk, pretending to read. But Sam wasn't focused on the book. His mind was racing, his heart beating harder than usual, though he couldn't say why. Or rather, he didn't want to admit why. "Hey, you okay?" Connor's voice broke the silence, and Sam looked up, startled. "Yeah, fine. Just tired," Sam mumbled, averting his gaze. Connor's eyes lingered on Sam for a beat longer than necessary before returning to his magazine. It was a small moment, barely noticeable, but it was the kind of moment that had become more frequent between them. A few days later, it happened again. This time, it was late at night. The house was quiet, their parents long since asleep. Sam was lying in bed, unable to sleep, his mind turning over thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. Across the room, Connor shifted in his bed, and then in the darkness, his voice came soft, almost hesitant. "Sam? Yeah? Have you ever thought about us?" Connor's voice was low, and Sam felt a chill run down his spine, even in the warmth of the summer night. "What do you mean?" Sam replied, though he knew exactly what Connor was asking. His pulse quickened, and he could feel his body tense in anticipation of what might come next. Connor didn't answer right away, and for a moment, Sam thought maybe he had imagined the whole thing. But then Connor spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Sometimes I wonder if we're too close. You know, in a way that's not normal." Sam swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if he should lie and brush it off, or if he should admit that he had been thinking the same thing for months, if not years. "Yeah," Sam finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "I know what you mean." The silence that followed was deafening. Sam lay there, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for Connor to say something else, but he didn't. Instead, they both lay there, the unspoken tension between them growing heavier with each passing second. After that night, things began to change. Slowly at first, like the way the sun sets gradually before it slips beneath the horizon. It was in the small things, the way their conversations lingered in the quiet moments when neither of them wanted to say what they were really thinking, the way they found excuses to touch, a hand brushing against an arm, a shoulder leaning just a little too close. Neither of them addressed it directly, but it was always there, a weight pressing down on them. The barrier between what they were and what they were becoming was thinning, and neither of them knew how to stop it. It wasn't until one evening, after their parents had left for a weekend trip, that everything came to a head. They were sitting on the porch, the summer air thick and humid. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light across the yard. Connor was unusually quiet, his gaze fixed on something far off in the distance, his fingers idly tracing patterns on the wooden armrest of his chair. Sam watched him out of the corner of his eye, his stomach knotting with anticipation. He could feel the tension between them like a storm building on the horizon, and he knew deep down that tonight was the night something would break. "You ever think about what it would be like if things were different?" Connor asked, his voice soft, almost casual. But there was an edge to it that Sam didn't miss. Sam's heart raced. "Different how?" he asked, though he already knew what Connor meant. Connor turned to look at him then, his green eyes dark and intense. "If we didn't have to pretend, if it was just us." The words hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. Sam could feel his pulse quicken, his breath catching in his throat. He had thought about it. Of course he had. But hearing Connor say it out loud, admitting what they had both been too afraid to acknowledge, made it real in a way that was terrifying. "Connor, I don't know if—" Before Sam could finish his sentence, Connor reached over, his hand gripping Sam's arm, his touch sending a jolt through Sam's body. It wasn't just a brotherly gesture anymore. It was something more, something neither of them could deny any longer. "Stop pretending, Sam," Connor said softly, his voice low but insistent. "We both know what this is." Sam stared at him, his mind racing, his body frozen. He wanted to pull away, wanted to tell Connor that they couldn't do this, that it was wrong. But instead, he found himself leaning in, his heart pounding in his chest as the space between them disappeared. The first kiss between Connor and Sam was slow, almost hesitant, as if they were testing the waters of something forbidden. Sam's pulse quickened the moment Connor leaned in, their faces only inches apart, the warmth of Connor's breath brushing against his cheek. For a moment, Sam thought he might pull away, that this could still be stopped, but as Connor's lips softly pressed against his, the air between them seemed to crackle with electricity. Time itself seemed to stop. Sam froze, his mind racing with 1,000 thoughts that clashed and collided, each one more confused than the last. This was wrong. It had to be wrong. But in that moment, with Connor's lips against his, none of it mattered. It felt right in a way that Sam couldn't explain, as though this was something they had both been waiting for their entire lives. As though all the silent moments, the lingering touches, had been leading to this. Their lips parted, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Sam could still feel the lingering warmth from the kiss, the way his pulse pounded in his ears. His mind was a whirl of emotions, fear, excitement, guilt, all clashing together in a confusing blur. He looked at Connor, whose eyes were filled with something Sam had never seen before, a mix of longing and certainty that sent a shiver down his spine. "We shouldn't," Sam whispered. But even as he said the words, they felt hollow, like a lie he was telling himself. "Don't say that," Connor murmured, his voice low and almost pleading. "This is real, Sam, we both know it." And just like that, the unspoken tension between them snapped, dissolving into something physical, something undeniable. When they finally pulled away, the air between them crackled with tension. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, the gravity of what had just happened sinking in. He expected Connor to say something, to break the silence, but Connor didn't. He just sat there, his hand still resting lightly on Sam's arm, his gaze steady and unwavering. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both unsure of what to do next. Sam could feel the rush of emotions swirling inside him, guilt, fear, excitement. But none of it felt real. It was as if they were trapped in a dream, one that he wasn't sure he wanted to wake up from. Finally, it was Connor who broke the silence. "This doesn't have to change anything," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. But Sam knew better. Everything had changed in that single moment, and there was no going back. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain the conflicting feelings that were tearing him apart inside? Connor leaned closer, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay, Sam. It's just us. No one else has to know." Those words, the promise of secrecy, were like a lifeline to Sam. If no one else knew, maybe it wouldn't be real. Maybe they could go on pretending just as they always had. Sam nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. And that seemed to be all the reassurance Connor needed. The affair began that night. What started as furtive touches and stolen moments quickly grew into something neither of them could control. When their parents weren't home, they'd spend hours locked in their bedroom, exploring the forbidden connection they had kept buried for so long. It felt exhilarating and terrifying all at once. Every touch, every glance carried the weight of something dangerous, something they knew could destroy them if it ever came to light. But the more they indulged in their secret, the more obsessed Connor became. At first, Sam didn't notice the subtle shift in his brother's behavior. Connor had always been the dominant twin, the one who took charge. So when he started dictating when and where they'd meet, Sam thought nothing of it. But then Connor started becoming possessive, watching Sam closely, asking constant questions about where he was and who he was with. It was as if their relationship had become a drug that Connor couldn't get enough of, and Sam was his only fix. One afternoon, while their parents were at work, Connor cornered Sam in the kitchen. Sam had been trying to avoid him, guilt gnawing at the edges of his mind, but Connor wouldn't let it go. "Why have you been avoiding me?" Connor asked, his voice tight, his eyes dark with something Sam couldn't quite place. "I'm not avoiding you," Sam replied, though even he knew it was a weak excuse. Connor stepped closer, backing Sam against the counter. "Don't lie to me, Sam. You've been distant ever since that night." Sam swallowed hard, his heart racing. He could feel the tension between them like a live wire ready to snap. He hated that this was happening, hated the fear that had begun creeping into their once innocent relationship. I need space, Connor," Sam said, his voice trembling. "We need space." Connor's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Sam saw a flicker of something dark, something possessive and dangerous in his brother's gaze. "Space? You're my brother, Sam. We've always been together. Why should that change now?" "It's not the same anymore," Sam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This thing between us, it's too much. It's not right." Connor's expression darkened, and for a moment, Sam thought his brother might lash out. But instead, Connor's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "You think you can just walk away from this? From me?" Sam's chest tightened, fear curling around his heart like a vice. He hadn't expected this reaction. He thought Connor would understand, that he would agree to slow things down, but now Sam wasn't so sure. He could see the obsessive gleam in his brother's eyes, and it terrified him. "You're not thinking straight, Connor," Sam said, trying to keep his voice calm. "This is all getting out of hand." Connor's hand shot out, grabbing Sam's arm in a bruising grip. "Out of hand? Sam, we're meant to be together. You know that. You've always known that." Sam tried to pull away, but Connor's grip tightened. Panic surged through Sam's chest. He had never seen Connor like this before, so desperate, so unhinged. "Connor, let go," Sam pleaded, his voice rising in panic. But Connor didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I'm not letting you go, Sam. Not now, not ever." The air between them was suffocating, the tension unbearable. Sam could feel the walls closing in, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to defuse the situation. He had to make Connor see reason, had to make him understand that what they were doing couldn't continue. "Connor, we're brothers," Sam said, his voice trembling. "This has to stop." For a moment, Connor just stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he released Sam's arm, stepping back with a bitter laugh. "You think this can stop? After everything we've been through?" Sam rubbed his arm where Connor had grabbed him, his skin still tingling from the contact. "It has to," he whispered. Though even as he said the words, he knew they wouldn't be enough. Connor's gaze turned cold, his voice low and dangerous. "You can try to end this, Sam, but you'll never be able to walk away from me, you know that." With that, Connor stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Sam standing there, his heart racing, his mind spinning. The room felt suddenly too small, too claustrophobic. Sam leaned against the counter, trying to catch his breath, trying to figure out what to do next. He had thought he could end it, thought he could pull back before things went too far. But now, as the weight of Connor's obsession settled over him, Sam realized that he had underestimated just how deep his brother's feelings ran. And as the days passed, Connor's behavior only grew more erratic. He began showing up unexpectedly, at all hours of the day and night, with no explanation other than his insistence that they spend more time together. It was as if Connor couldn't bear to be apart from Sam, not even for a few hours. He'd text constantly, asking where Sam was, who he was with, and why he wasn't home. Sam's attempts to create distance, to find some breathing room, only seemed to fuel Connor's need for control, for possession. Connor's obsession became all-encompassing. He started questioning Sam's every move, becoming suspicious of the most mundane interactions. Even when Sam was at work or out with friends, he felt Connor's presence looming over him, as if he were being watched from afar. It was suffocating. Every time Sam tried to pull away, to reclaim even a fragment of his independence, Connor would tighten his grip, emotionally and physically. There were moments when Connor's jealousy became unbearable, an irrational rage simmering beneath the surface, masked by concern but driven by a dark need to own every part of Sam. The more Sam resisted, the more dangerous Connor's obsession became, trapping them both in a cycle of escalating tension that neither could escape. The affair had spiraled far beyond anything Sam could control, and with each passing day, the fear in his chest grew stronger. He knew deep down that this couldn't go on forever. Something had to give. Something had to break. Sam couldn't shake the growing fear that followed him like a shadow, ever present, pressing down on his chest with every passing day. What had once felt like a deep, unspoken connection between him and Connor had morphed into something darker, an obsession that clung to them both, suffocating Sam. Every time he met Connor's gaze, he saw the desperation hidden behind his brother's eyes, the possessiveness that threatened to consume them both. The love they once shared had twisted into something toxic, a suffocating web of emotions that Sam no longer knew how to navigate. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. What had started as secretive, thrilling moments now felt like chains tightening around his neck. Each time he tried to distance himself from Connor, to pull away from the dangerous path they were on, Connor would pull him back in with a look, a touch, a reminder of how deep they had gone. The lines between love and obsession, right and wrong, blurred until Sam couldn't see them anymore. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, the weight of their secret dragging him deeper into a dark place where he no longer recognized himself. Sam often lay awake at night staring at the ceiling, wondering how he had allowed things to go so far. Could he end it? Could he escape? Or had he already crossed a line from which there was no return? Each moment he stayed with Connor, each time he allowed the obsession to take hold, it felt like he was losing a piece of himself, and he wasn't sure how much more he could lose before there was nothing left. Weeks passed, and with them, Connor's behavior became more unpredictable. He began following Sam around town, showing up at his friends' houses unannounced, interrupting conversations with invasive questions. He'd appear at the door late at night, eyes wild, demanding to know why Sam hadn't answered his calls. Sam would try to calm him down, try to reason with him, but nothing seemed to work. Connor was slipping further into his obsession, and Sam didn't know how to stop it. One evening, after yet another argument, Sam finally decided he couldn't do it anymore. The suffocating weight of Connor's possessiveness had become too much, and he knew he had to get out. Out of their house, out of their lives, out of the mess that their relationship had become. He had packed a bag and left a note on the kitchen table, his hands trembling as he wrote the words, "I can't do this anymore. I'm leaving." He didn't know where he would go, but he knew he had to escape, even if only for a few days. Maybe the distance would give him the clarity he so desperately needed. Maybe it would help Connor see reason. But as Sam slung his bag over his shoulder and opened the front door, he found Connor standing on the porch, his expression dark and unreadable. "Where are you going?" Connor's voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but there was a coldness to it that made Sam's heart skip a beat. Sam swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "I'm leaving, Connor. I need space. We both do." Connor stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice sharper now, filled with barely contained anger. "You think you can just walk away from me? From this?" Sam's chest tightened as panic set in. He hadn't anticipated this, hadn't thought that Connor would catch him before he could get away. "Connor, please just let me go. I need to think." Connor's eyes flashed with fury. "Think about what? About how you can abandon me? About how you can leave me after everything we've been through?" Sam tried to push past him, but Connor grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "You're not leaving," Connor repeated, his voice trembling with anger. "I won't let you." The fear that had been simmering inside Sam for weeks suddenly boiled over. He yanked his arm free, his voice rising in desperation. "This has to end, Connor. We can't keep doing this." But Connor wasn't listening. His face twisted with a mix of rage and hurt, and before Sam could react, Connor shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward into the hallway. Sam's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, his mind spinning. He had to get out of there, had to get away from Connor before things escalated even further. But Connor was already on him, his hands grabbing Sam's shoulders, shaking him violently. "You can't leave me, Sam," Connor shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "You promised we'd always be together. You're mine." Sam struggled against his brother's grip, panic surging through his veins. "Connor, stop. This isn't you." But Connor wasn't stopping. His hands tightened around Sam's throat, his eyes wild with desperation. "If I can't have you, no one can," he growled, his voice a dangerous whisper. Sam gasped for breath, his vision blurring as Connor's grip tightened. He could feel his strength slipping away, the room spinning around him. In that moment, he realized just how far Connor had fallen, just how dangerous his obsession had become. This wasn't the brother he had grown up with, the brother who had been his closest friend. This was someone else, someone consumed by a dark, uncontrollable need. With a surge of adrenaline, Sam managed to shove Connor off him, gasping for air as he stumbled backward. His mind raced, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. He had to get out of there. He had to escape before Connor did something they would both regret. But Connor wasn't done. His face twisted with rage, he lunged at Sam again, knocking him to the floor. The two brothers struggled, their bodies colliding as they fought for control. Sam's heart pounded in his chest, fear and adrenaline coursing through him. He had never been more terrified in his life. And then, in the chaos of the struggle, it happened. Sam's hand closed around a heavy metal candlestick on the floor, his fingers gripping it tightly. In a moment of pure, instinctual panic, he swung it hard, striking Connor across the side of his head. The sound was sickening, a dull, heavy thud that echoed through the house, followed by a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the room whole. Connor crumpled to the floor, motionless. For a moment, Sam just sat there, staring in disbelief at his brother's still form, his mind unable to process what had just happened. His hands trembled, the candlestick slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor beside him. "Connor?" Sam whispered, his voice shaky, barely audible. "Connor." But there was no response. Connor didn't move. He didn't make a sound. Sam crawled over to him, his heart pounding in his chest as he reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed against Connor's cheek. His skin was warm, but there was no movement, no sign of life. Panic surged through Sam's veins as he shook Connor's shoulder, his voice rising in desperation. "Connor, wake up, please, wake up." But it was no use. Connor was gone. Sam's world collapsed at that moment. He stared down at his twin brother, the boy who had been his other half for as long as he could remember, the boy who had shared his every secret, his every fear, his every joy. And now, he was gone, taken by the very obsession that had consumed them both. Tears streamed down Sam's face as he knelt beside his brother's lifeless body, his hands trembling uncontrollably. His mind was a whirlwind of shock, guilt, and disbelief. He had never meant for this to happen, never thought their twisted relationship would end like this. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, suffocating him as he gasped for air between sobs. How had it come to this? All the moments of doubt, the nights spent wondering if he should walk away, and yet he stayed, thinking he could somehow manage it, keep everything from falling apart. But now it was too late. The sight of Connor's still face, eyes closed forever, made it all too real. There was no undoing what had been done, no words that could take it back. The love they once shared, twisted and poisoned by obsession, had led them here, to this point of no return. Sam could feel the cold floor beneath his knees, but the world around him felt distant, surreal. The damage was irreversible, and as he knelt there, he knew that his life, like Connor's, would never be the same. There was no going back, only the haunting future that awaited him. Sam didn't know how long he sat there, cradling his brother's lifeless form, his sobs racking his body. Time seemed to blur, the weight of what he had done pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. Eventually, Sam stood, his legs shaky beneath him. He wiped the tears from his face, his mind numb as he looked down at Connor one last time. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't face what he had done. With one final glance at his twin, Sam turned and walked out of the house, leaving behind the only person who had ever truly known him. In the wake of Connor's death, Sam's world fell apart. The guilt was suffocating, wrapping itself around him like a heavy blanket he couldn't throw off. The police were called that night, and Sam, still in shock, barely managed to explain what had happened. The officers took him in for questioning, but it was clear to everyone, even the authorities, that this was a tragic accident. Self-defense in the face of an unrelenting obsession. Connor was gone, and with him, the weight of a secret that should never have existed in the first place. But as the days passed, the reality of his actions began to settle in. Sam had killed his brother, his twin, the one person he had shared everything with since birth. The bond they had was broken, and it couldn't be repaired. The town was quiet, but the whispers were louder than ever. In small towns like Redwood, news spread quickly. Neighbors exchanged glances, their curiosity barely veiled. The once warm greetings Sam used to receive turned cold, replaced with avoidance and suspicion. The Lennox name was tainted, now associated with a dark and twisted scandal that no one had seen coming. Sam withdrew from the world, unable to face the people who had once known him. The house that he and Connor had shared became a prison, filled with memories he couldn't escape. Every corner of that house reminded him of Connor. Their childhood laughter, the whispered secrets, and the obsession that had spiraled out of control. The weight of it all was unbearable. Their parents, devastated by the loss, fell into their own spirals of grief. The family shattered. Their mother couldn't look at Sam without seeing Connor, and their father, always distant, now seemed even more removed, lost in his own world of guilt and regret. They moved away, trying to escape the suffocating reminders of what had happened. But Sam stayed behind, trapped in the town that had once been his home but now felt like a graveyard. As the months turned into years, Sam tried to rebuild his life. But the shadow of Connor's death followed him wherever he went. He couldn't escape the looks, the questions, the guilt that gnawed at him every waking moment. He tried to move on, to forget, but forgetting was impossible. How could he? His brother was gone, and he was the one who had taken him away. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, Sam couldn't help but feel the echoes of Connor's presence. Late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside was still, he'd hear it. The faint sound of Connor's voice, calling his name. He knew it wasn't real, but it felt real enough to make his heart race. The memories of their twisted affair, the lies, the obsession, they haunted him, refusing to let him move on. In the end, Sam was left with nothing but the hollow shell of a life that could never be rebuilt. His story became a cautionary tale, whispered in the town of Redwood for years to come. A story of brothers whose love had crossed lines it was never meant to, and the destruction that had followed.